Hello, my name is Barbara Straight, and you are here in the historic Santa Fe Depot in Dodge City, Kansas. This is probably the best building in Dodge City, at least in my opinion. The building was built in 1897 and dedicated in 1898. This part of the building is the dining room. It's called the El Vaquero. But there were baggage rooms, there were hotel rooms, a hotel lobby, kitchen, and down in the other end of the building there was actually a lunchroom. Before I can talk about the Harvey girls, I need to talk about Fred Harvey and his impact on eating and settling the West with fine dining establishments. Fred Harvey came to the United States in about 1850. He was about 15 years old, and the first job that he had was as a pot licker or a pot scrubber or a dishwasher in a restaurant in New York City. From there, he ended up in New Orleans, St. Louis, and finally he made his home in Leavenworth, Kansas. But along the way, Fred learned a lot about fine dining, what was good and what was bad, and owned a couple of different restaurants. One he had with a partner, and it was about 1860. The Civil War was ready to break out, and Fred and his partner evidently disagreed on which side to be for, because his partner left one night with all the money and headed south. So Fred was broke, but that didn't stop him. He picked up, headed out, started again. One of the last jobs he had before he started this restaurant business that I'm going to talk about was as a mail clerk on the railroad. And the railroad had a boxcar, and they sorted the mail in the boxcar, and then they would leave the bags of mail at the towns and cities as they went through them. Well, one of the things that was happening, that Fred saw was happening when he was working on this, was that people would pay to eat, to get off the train to eat, because they didn't have dining rooms, dining cars. So people would pay ahead of time. They would get off and go into these, I even hate to call them restaurants, some of them were just eating establishments. And too often what was happening is the food was horrible. The biscuits were called sinkers. You can maybe imagine why they were called that. The coffee was bitter, rancid. The food was often spoiled. And people had paid, again, ahead of time, so they sat down to eat or stood along these counters to eat. The whistle would blow and they would have to get back on the train. They couldn't finish their food. There wasn't any such thing as a doggy bag or a to-go bag, so the food was left. The bad thing that was happening was the restaurants, the eating establishments would take that food back into the kitchen, stir it up with some of the new food, and serve it again. So people were getting terribly sick from eating. I like to say, think about, if you're a student, think about going into the lunchroom. You've sat down to eat, you have your plate, and you have macaroni, cheese, and hot dogs, and the fire alarm goes off, and you have to leave. And by the time you get ready to get done, you can't go back into the lunchroom. It's the next group's turn. Well, the lunch ladies, they didn't go out because they knew it was just a practice. They saw all that food sitting there and they said, what a waste. We just can't let that go to waste. They take it back into the cafeteria, to the kitchen part, put that macaroni and cheese back in the pot, cut up the part of the hot dog that you maybe bit on, and put that back in, stirred it all up, and served it again. Think how horrible that would be. Well, that's what was happening along the railroad. And Fred Harvey just knew that he could do something about it. So he went to a couple of different railroads and said, hey, I want to run your restaurants. I want to open restaurants along your routes. And they said no, they weren't interested in him. But they told him to go to this new upstart railroad called the Atchison, the Topeka, and the Santa Fe, which was in Topeka, Kansas. So he went, talked to the owner, and they made a deal on a handshake. They never did sign any papers. On a handshake that Fred Harvey would run all the eating establishments, all the restaurants, all the lunchrooms, and all the hotels along the Santa Fe. And the Santa Fe was moving from Topeka out to California eventually, up to Chicago, and heading down south. So the first place they gave Fred Harvey was the Topeka lunchroom. He went into the lunchroom, tore everything out, brought in fine linens, fine china, new flatware, and cleaned it up. And then he hired a chef. And people came from miles around to eat in this lunchroom. In fact, Santa Fe was worried that people didn't want to move on. They wanted to stay there because it was such a great place to eat. So eventually, as the Santa Fe is moving west, Fred Harvey is opening lunchrooms, hotels, dining rooms along the Santa Fe. So when this building was opened, Fred Harvey, again, the Harvey Company, opened this, the dining room here and a lunchroom. This dining room, they had a contest and they named it the El Vaquero, which is Spanish for the cowboy. And so that's where we are today. Now that I've finished talking to you about Fred Harvey, we would like you to try this recipe that comes from one of the Fred Harvey cookbooks.